Imagine knowing that by sunrise, your entire bloodline may no longer exist. Inside Osaka Castle, the night felt unnaturally quiet. Not peaceful, quiet in the way a forest becomes quiet before a storm tears through. Samurai sat beneath flickering lanterns, running whetstones across sword blades that had already seen too much war. Women whispered prayers to gods who had remained silent through decades of bloodshed. Somewhere deep inside the castle, children slept, unaware that history had already decided their fate. Beyond the walls, an ocean of fire stretched across the darkness. Hundreds of thousands of torches. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers. An army so vast that some witnesses later claimed the earth itself seemed to glow beneath its campfires. The banners belonged to one man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful ruler in Japan. And he had come for Osaka. But that was the strange part. Tokugawa had already won. Years earlier, he had crushed his enemies and established himself as the dominant force in the country. Most men in his position would have been satisfied. Most rulers would have focused on governing their new realm. Tokugawa did something different. He returned with one of the largest armies Japan had ever seen. Not to conquer territory, not to suppress a rebellion, but to destroy a family. Inside Osaka Castle lived Toyotomi Hideyori, the son of the late Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And for reasons that were still not entirely clear to many people at the time, Tokugawa believed Hideyori had to disappear. Completely. Not defeated. Not imprisoned. Erased. The people inside the castle understood what that meant. Rumors had circulated for months. Every messenger arriving from the outside world carried darker news than the one before. More troops were gathering. More daimyo were pledging support to Tokugawa. More roads were filling with soldiers marching toward Osaka. The trap was closing, and everyone knew it. Yet something strange was happening behind those walls. Despite the fear, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the certainty that they were facing the most powerful military force in Japan, men continued arriving. Ronin, masterless samurai, veterans from old wars, warriors with no land, no future, and often no hope. They kept coming, not because they believed victory was likely. Many of them openly admitted it was not. They came because Osaka had become something larger than a fortress. It had become a symbol, a final stand, a chance to resist the growing power of Tokugawa before it became permanent. And that made the situation far more dangerous than it appeared. Because this was no longer simply a military confrontation. It was a struggle over legitimacy, over memory, over who had the right to rule Japan. Inside the castle, Hideyori himself waited. He was no longer the child many people remembered. He had grown into adulthood while the country around him changed. Yet every decision he made carried a burden inherited from his father. A burden that was now threatening to destroy everyone around him. The worst part was that nobody could be certain how much danger they were truly in. Some believed Tokugawa merely wanted submission. Others believed negotiations were still possible. A few hoped the massive show of force was simply intimidation. But there were whispers spreading through Osaka. Whispers that Tokugawa's real objective had never been peace. Whispers that the siege itself was only the beginning. That the true target was not Osaka Castle. It was the Toyotomi bloodline. Every member of it. If those whispers were true, surrender might not save anyone. And if surrender could not save them, then what options remained? As midnight approached, the walls of Osaka stood illuminated by distant campfires. The defenders watched the horizon. The attackers watched the castle. Neither side slept much, because somewhere beneath the silence, everyone could feel it. The final chapter had already begun. What nobody realized yet was that the road to this moment had started long before the first soldier arrived outside Osaka's walls. It had begun with the death of a man who once ruled all of Japan, and with a child who inherited far more than his father's name. When Toyotomi Hideyori died in 1598, he left behind a unified Japan. That alone was remarkable. For generations, warlords had fought endlessly across the country. Provinces burned. Alliances shifted. Betrayals became routine. Entire clans vanished overnight. Then Hideyori succeeded where countless others had failed. He brought the chaos under control, at least temporarily. But there was one problem. His chosen successor was only a child. Toyotomi Hideyori was far too young to defend what his father had built. And everyone knew it. Power rarely remains empty for long. The moment Hideyori died, ambitious men began calculating their next move. Among them stood Tokugawa Ieyasu. Patient, careful, dangerously intelligent. Unlike many rivals, Tokugawa understood something important. He did not need to seize power immediately. He only needed to wait. And waiting became his greatest weapon. Over the following years, political tensions spread through Japan. Alliances fractured. Former supporters of Hideyori drifted into competing camps. The fragile peace began cracking from within. Then came the moment that changed everything. The Battle of Sekigahara. In 1600, rival coalitions collided in one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history. Thousands died. Entire clans gambled their futures on a single day. When the fighting ended, Tokugawa emerged victorious. The road to supremacy lay open before him. 3 years later, he became shogun. Officially, legally, publicly. To many observers, the struggle for power appeared finished. But appearances can be deceptive. Because even after Sekigahara, even after becoming shogun, even after establishing a new government, Tokugawa still had a problem. A living one. Toyotomi Hideyori. The young heir remained inside Osaka Castle, surrounded by enormous wealth and loyal retainers. More importantly, he possessed something Tokugawa could never fully acquire: legitimacy. Hideyori was the son of the man who had unified Japan. That fact alone made him dangerous. Many former Toyotomi supporters never truly accepted Tokugawa's rise. They obeyed him. They feared him. But acceptance was another matter entirely. In private conversations, doubts lingered. What if Hideyori eventually challenged Tokugawa? What if dissatisfied daimyo rallied around him? What if Osaka became the center of a future rebellion? The questions never disappeared. And that was exactly the problem. Every year Hideyori remained alive. He remained an alternative. A possibility. A banner under which opposition could gather. Tokugawa had built a new political order. But as long as the Toyotomi heir existed, that order rested on unstable ground. Most people could not see the danger yet. The country appeared peaceful. Trade resumed. Cities prospered. Life moved forward. Yet beneath the surface, distrust continued growing. On one side stood the Tokugawa regime. On the other stood the lingering shadow of the Toyotomi legacy. Neither side openly declared war. Not yet. But the distance between them was shrinking. And eventually, someone would find a reason to ignite the conflict. The reason arrived in a form so unexpected that many people initially refused to believe it. A temple bell, a few words carved into bronze, and an accusation that would push Japan toward its final great civil war. In another time, the inscription might have gone unnoticed. A religious dedication, a ceremonial message, nothing more. Instead, it became one of the most controversial pieces of metal in Japanese history. In 1614, workers completed a massive bell for Hokoji Temple in Kyoto. The project had been sponsored by Toyotomi Hideyori. At first glance, it seemed harmless. A public display of piety, a contribution to a sacred institution. Yet shortly after the bell was completed, officials connected to Tokugawa Ieyasu began raising concerns. They claimed certain phrases in the inscription contained hidden meanings, hidden insults, hidden curses, hidden attacks against the shogun himself. The accusation spread rapidly. According to Tokugawa's supporters, the wording symbolically divided his name and wished misfortune upon him. To modern observers, the argument may sound questionable. Even at the time, many suspected something else was happening, because the timing was difficult to ignore. For years, Tokugawa had tolerated the existence of Osaka. For years, tension had been building. For years, Hideyori's growing influence had remained a source of concern. And suddenly, a temple bell had become a national crisis. Coincidence? Or opportunity? Nobody could prove it. But the consequences were immediate. Demands were issued. Explanations were requested. Pressure increased. Negotiations began. Then they began to fail. The more the two sides communicated, the worse the situation became. Distrust poisoned every discussion. Each concession seemed to create new demands. Each attempt at compromise generated fresh suspicion. Soon, people across Japan sensed that something larger was unfolding. Ronin began moving toward Osaka. Veteran warriors who had lost masters during previous conflicts suddenly found a cause. Military preparations accelerated. Supplies entered the city. Defenses strengthened. And outside Osaka, Tokugawa started assembling an army of staggering size. Officially, peace still existed. Unofficially, everyone was preparing for war. What happened next changed everything. Because once the armies began moving, there would be no easy path back. And hidden behind the political arguments, the religious controversy, and the diplomatic exchanges was a terrifying possibility. Perhaps the bell had never been the real issue. Perhaps Tokugawa had already made his decision years earlier. And perhaps Osaka Castle was about to discover what happens when the most powerful man in Japan decides that a rival bloodline can no longer be allowed to exist. By the autumn of 1614, there was little doubt left about Tokugawa Ieyasu's intentions. Diplomacy had failed. The arguments over the Hokoji bell had faded into the background, replaced by something far more tangible. Across central Japan, roads filled with marching soldiers. Supply wagons stretched for miles. Daimyo who had once fought against one another now answered the same summons. Osaka was about to be surrounded. When the Tokugawa army finally appeared, its sheer size stunned even experienced veterans. Contemporary estimates differ, but most agree that well over 200,000 men participated in the campaign. Never before had Osaka Castle faced such overwhelming force. Yet appearances can deceive. Tokugawa possessed the larger army. The defenders possessed the stronger fortress. Osaka Castle had been built by Toyotomi Hideyoshi himself, and every wall reflected decades of military experience. Massive stone ramparts towered over deep moats. Towers overlooked every possible avenue of attack. Any commander foolish enough to rush forward would pay dearly for every step. And Tokugawa soon discovered exactly that. One position proved especially troublesome. South of the castle stood a fortified outwork known as the Sanada-maru, commanded by one of Japan's most respected warriors, Sanada Yukimura. Yukimura understood something many commanders overlooked. He didn't need to defeat the Tokugawa army. He only needed to make every attack unbearably expensive. Again and again, Tokugawa soldiers advanced toward the earthworks. Again and again, they were driven back. Arrows darkened the winter sky. Matchlock volleys erupted from hidden positions. Spearmen emerged from behind the barricades before disappearing just as quickly. Every assault left the attackers with more casualties and fewer answers. Word spread rapidly through both camps. The supposedly unstoppable Tokugawa army had been halted. For the first time since Sekigahara, people began asking a question few had dared to consider. Could Tokugawa actually lose? Inside Osaka, morale rose. Outside, frustration mounted. The siege dragged on as winter tightened its grip. Cold rain soaked armor. Supplies became harder to move. Every additional day increased the cost of continuing the campaign. Ieyasu had spent years building an image of absolute authority. A prolonged stalemate threatened that image. He needed another solution. Eventually, negotiations reopened. Peace terms were proposed. Hostilities would end. The Toyotomi household would remain in Osaka. At first glance, it seemed like an unexpected compromise. Many inside the castle believed the nightmare had finally passed. After weeks of bombardment and relentless pressure, survival itself felt like victory. But hidden inside the agreement was a condition whose consequences few fully appreciated. Tokugawa engineer would oversee the filling of Osaka's outer moats. Officially, it was presented as a practical measure to prevent future conflict. Unofficially, it stripped away the castle's greatest advantage. Workers arrived with earth timber, and laborers. Day after day, the defensive trenches disappeared beneath tons of soil. The deep barriers that had frustrated one of Japan's largest armies slowly vanished. Some Toyotomi advisors protested. Others argued the peace had to be preserved. Hideyori hesitated. Perhaps he still hoped coexistence remained possible. Perhaps he believed Tokugawa had finally achieved what he wanted. But nobody inside Osaka seemed willing to ask the obvious question. Why would a ruler who had mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers suddenly settle for half measures? The answer would arrive only months later. By then, the castle would no longer possess the defenses that had once made it nearly impossible to capture. The peace had never truly been peace. It had merely been the first stage of a far more carefully planned destruction. And when spring gave way to summer, Tokugawa returned. This time, he intended to finish what he had started. The truce collapsed almost as quickly as it had been signed. Both sides accused the other of violating its terms. Whether those accusations were genuine or simply convenient no longer mattered. War had become inevitable. But Osaka was no longer the fortress that had survived the winter. Its protective moats had been filled. Sections of its outer defenses had been dismantled. The castle still looked imposing from a distance. In reality, it had been quietly weakened from within. Tokugawa moved before the defenders could recover. In the summer of 1615, his armies advanced once again toward Osaka. This campaign unfolded differently. Instead of waiting behind thick fortifications, Toyotomi forces launched aggressive attacks outside the castle, hoping to break the siege before it tightened completely. The result was a series of brutal engagements across the plains surrounding Osaka. Among them, one battle would become legendary. Tennoji. Thousands of samurai collided in desperate fighting that lasted for hours. Smoke drifted across open fields as volleys of gunfire mixed with cavalry charges and spear formations. Veterans who had survived decades of civil war understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not another campaign. It was the final battle of an era. At the center of the fighting stood Sanada Yukimura. Despite exhaustion and overwhelming odds, he continued directing attacks against Tokugawa's advancing forces. Several contemporary accounts describe moments when his assaults came dangerously close to reaching Tokugawa Ieyasu himself. For a brief moment, history seemed ready to change. If Tokugawa fell, everything might unravel. But fortune finally abandoned Osaka. Yukimura collapsed after relentless combat, exhausted and gravely weakened. Before long, he was killed. News of his death spread with devastating speed. The defenders lost not only a commander, they lost their confidence. Tokugawa recognized the moment immediately. Fresh troops surged forward. One defensive line after another gave way. Soon the fighting reached the castle itself. Fire erupted across wooden structures as panic spread among civilians seeking shelter. Smoke rolled through courtyards where only months earlier children had played without fear. The sounds inside Osaka changed. No longer disciplined commands. No longer organized resistance. Only confusion. The Toyotomi position was collapsing. Yet Tokugawa's objective had never been limited to capturing a castle. Buildings could be rebuilt. Walls could be repaired. A dynasty could not. And that distinction made the final hours infinitely more terrifying. Because somewhere inside the burning fortress remained the people Tokugawa had pursued all along. As flames spread through Osaka Castle, escape became almost impossible. The fortress that had once symbolized the Toyotomi family's power was now becoming its tomb. Toyotomi Hideyori understood the reality facing him. Relief would not arrive. No hidden army waited beyond the horizon. No powerful daimyo was coming to reverse the tide. The dynasty founded by his father had reached its final hours. Alongside his mother Yododon, Hideyori withdrew deeper into the burning castle. There, according to historical accounts, both chose death over capture. With their deaths, the political heart of the Toyotomi family ceased to exist. But Tokugawa Ieyasu was not yet finished. Victory on the battlefield solved only part of the problem. As long as legitimate heirs remained alive, future rebellions could still emerge under the Toyotomi name. The surviving members of the family were hunted down. Hideyori's young son, Toyotomi Kunimatsu, was captured not long afterward. Despite his age, he was executed, ending the direct male line of Hideyoshi's descendants. Other relatives were scattered into religious life exile or obscurity, their political influence deliberately erased. It was systematic, calculated, complete. Tokugawa had not merely defeated a rival. He had removed the possibility of that rival ever returning. Only then did Japan truly enter a new age. Without the Toyotomi household, organized resistance to Tokugawa authority rapidly faded. The Tokugawa shogunate consolidated its control over the country, ushering in more than 2.5 centuries of relative internal peace during the Edo period. To later generations, that peace often appeared inevitable. It was anything but. It had been secured through decades of political calculation, military victory, and finally, the destruction of one family whose very existence threatened the stability of the new regime. That is why the siege of Osaka occupies such a unique place in Japanese history. It was the last great conflict of the Sengoku age, the final chapter of the war that had consumed Japan for generations. Yet beyond the armies and battlefields lies a more unsettling story. Tokugawa Ieyasu already possessed power. He already possessed legitimacy in the eyes of many. What he lacked was certainty. As long as another dynasty remained alive, however weak it appeared, uncertainty survived with it. So he chose permanence over mercy. History would remember him as the founder of one of Japan's longest-lasting governments. History would also remember that government began only after the complete destruction of the family that had unified Japan before him. The fires that consumed Osaka Castle eventually died. The smoke disappeared. The walls were rebuilt under new masters. But the Toyotomi name never recovered. It lingered only in chronicles paintings and whispered memories of a dynasty that had risen to unite a fractured nation, only to vanish in a single, relentless campaign of political annihilation. And perhaps that is the darkest lesson left behind by Osaka. Sometimes the most decisive victory is not the one that conquers a fortress. It is the one that convinces the future that no alternative ever existed.